Good morning to those that have just joined us. When I say good morning, I'm making the assumption you are in the UK, which may be a dangerous assumption because certainly a number of the speakers we've got with us are from all parts of the world. But good morning. We'll just sit tight for a couple of minutes and we'll wait for others to join us. We'll just wait another couple of minutes, but we won't wait too much longer. All right, we might get underway now. We've still probably got a number of people to join us. I think word's got out about the sizzling nature of my introduction, so people have decided to join maybe a few minutes late. Word's getting out. By way of introduction, my name's Richard Basil-Jones. I'm the CEO of the Australia-UK Chamber of Commerce, and we're delighted to be hosting this webinar about setting up in Australia and supported by Sheltons, as well as Department of Business and Trade and Austrade, two government departments, which I'll introduce in a minute. So just some brief housekeeping activities to begin with. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded and will be hosted on the Australia-UK Chamber website, but also we will be sending a link to all those that have registered for viewing at a later time if you want to catch up on some details. And also the details of the speakers, the Sheltons group will be provided as well, along with the content. So if you miss anything, it will all be there for you to review it at a later time. Other point to make is that there is a Q&A button at the top of your screen. If you have questions during the course of this presentation, please feel free to register the question and we'll get to that towards the end. But also be aware that the opportunity to respond to your questions will be taken up by Sheltons as well at a later stage if need be. So don't feel that the questions will be ignored. We'll capture them and make sure that everything is responded to. All right, look, let's get underway for the real show. And we're going to start, actually with David Camerlengo, who's our Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner for the UK and Ireland for Austrade. And We wanted to start with David, and then we're going to move on to Kirsty Whitford from Department of Business and Trade for the UK to really just set the framework and to talk about the support that exists by both UK and Australia government for companies who are entertaining the move to Australia and vice versa, as the case often is. So look, on that introduction, I'm just going to pass over to David Camerlengo from Austrade. Thank you, David.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Richard. Good morning to everybody and good evening to those that are in Australia. Thanks you to the Chamber for putting on this webinar with some really important content, and thank you to the various speakers, including the speakers from Sheltons. I'm actually reminiscing back to a time when back in the private sector, I was expanding a business into the US from Australia and had lots of hard knocks over that period because we didn't get the level of education that you're providing right here in this webinar. So it's a testimony to the efforts here. Really, really valuable content. As Richard mentioned, I'm with a federal government agency called Austrade, Australian Trade and Investment Commission. We are the federal government's commercial-facing agency, driving our trade and investment relationship between Australia and the world. I'm based here in London, as we also have representation from 5 of our Australian states here in London. Maybe I'll just talk very briefly about the relationship and then the support that can be provided. And I know you're going to hear from Kirsty from Department of Business and Trade, who we work really closely with as well on why Australia and the support that they provide. But just briefly, I'll just talk quickly about the relationship. So Australia-United Kingdom relationship is an incredibly strong relationship, not just economically, as we're going to talk about today, but also from a defence and security perspective. However, it is a very important trade and investment corridor. We have a long history of investment in each other's respective countries. The UK has been Australia's second largest source country for foreign investment. But equally, the UK is also Australia's second most favourable destination for outbound foreign direct investment. So we've always had this long history of investment in each other's regions. That has grown also considerably as we've got more Australian super funds looking for greater exposure around the world, and it's a great place for those opportunities to emerge here in the UK. But increasingly, our trading relationship is strengthening, particularly as we're coming up to the celebration of the 2-year anniversary of the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement on the 31st of May of this year, 2025. We've had many sessions previously on the Free Trade Agreement, so I'm not going to go into detail on that, but just to quickly highlight that Free Trade Agreement is not just about the reduction of tariffs on 99% of goods, although that's very relevant and topical at this time in the world, but it also includes many other provisions of which UK businesses, which is probably the focus of today's webinar, and Australian businesses can benefit from, including around mobility, including around government procurement, mutual recognition of qualifications. There's a chapter on digital trade, etc. So there's a lot of provisions in there. I'd suggest you to take a look at that as well if you're considering Australia as a priority market. There are numerous opportunities for UK businesses. I'm not going to talk much about them today. Probably just to highlight, we had a recent election in Australia and we have a continuation of the government of the prior 3 years. One of the priorities of that government has been around our net zero ambitions, including our energy transition and decarbonisation agenda, which presents itself with significant opportunities for UK businesses. We've got a really diverse economy, which you might hear from Kirsty from around various sectors ranging from, I talked about energy, mining, minerals, agriculture, tourism, health, manufacturing, defence, but also somewhat similar to the UK, services and technology are a big part of our economy. Services accounts for close to 70% of our economic output. And it also accounts for about 50% of our trade between Australia and the UK is services related. So it's certainly something that can be somewhat underrated. We often think about goods when we talk about the trading relationship, but services and tech is certainly the bulk of the relationship. I'll also just mention that Australia, we are a relatively decentralized nation. for those of you that have had to travel across different parts of Australia, you'll realise that the Australian states and territories are very independent and provide their own unique economic opportunities and pathways for UK businesses. And as I mentioned earlier, we have 5 of the Australian states here in London, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, and Queensland that all have offices here to support particularly UK investment into Australia. But look, first and foremost, I think the Department of Business and Trade does an exceptional job of supporting UK exporters with their entry into the UK market. For those companies that are then at the next stage looking to expand or establish or grow a presence, including growing a workforce or perhaps establishing operations with an investment, that's where Austrade and particularly the states might lean in terms of the facilitation and support. And of course, the Australia-UK Chamber plays a critical role in connecting businesses with partners domestically and here in the UK. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a snapshot of at a high level and also the support that exists. We wish everybody all the best on their journey in terms of pursuing the Australian market. And I'll now hand back to Richard to progress the webinar. But thanks very much, Richard.
Yeah, look again, just if I can sort of give a tip to any of the companies or individuals looking to sort of move, look for the resources and support that the governments offer. Obviously, we're going to certainly recommend you take professional guidance from companies like Sheltons, but in terms of resources that the governments in both UK and Australia offer, definitely tap into those. It's highly valuable. On that note, good bilateral, good balanced sort of webinar. We go from Australia representative, we now go to the UK representative, and Kirsty Whitford, who's Trade and Investment Sector Lead for the Department for Business and Trade in the UK. And as David said, great allies and great supporters of everything between UK and Australia. So on that note, Kirsty, the camera is yours.
Would help if I went off mute. Thank you so much, Richard, and thanks very much to the Oz UK Chamber for having us on, and fantastic to be obviously continuing our good work with Austrade and with Sheltons as well. So as Richard mentioned, my name is Kirsty Whitford. I am the Trade and Investment Sector Lead with the UK Government's Department for Business and Trade. I'm based in Australia in our Melbourne office, but with my team and the sector teams that work with the department in Australia, we cover the whole of Australia and New Zealand as well. So we really offer market expertise and contact through our specialist networks in both the UK and Australia. And we work out of our British consulates in Melbourne, Brisbane, Canberra, Sydney and Perth. So quite a broad array. And obviously we also offer that support in the New Zealand market for those looking to make the jump into New Zealand as well. So our UK Government in Australia support network includes our Department for Business and Trade, which I'm a part of, but also groups like Scottish Development International, Invest Northern Ireland, our Foreign and Commonwealth Office, our policy teams, communications teams, science and innovation teams, and more. So it's quite a full-fledged group that we have in Australia, really trying to support UK companies to make the most of the Australian and New Zealand opportunities. So through our specialist, trade advisors, our sector teams and our export support service, we actually cover a pretty decent amount of industries. I know all of those on the call today are from a wide variety, but it's everything from technology, financial and professional services, which is what my team does, but other teams, including consumer and retail, education, healthcare, life sciences and the sports economy, it's food and beverage and agriculture, infrastructure, energy, and then of course our defense, cybersecurity, civil security and space teams. So if there's an industry you can think of, it's more than likely that there'll be a team in Australia that can support you as you're moving into market. Now, our support is really quite bespoke. So it's based on what your level of market entry you're trying to do, whether you're an exporter, whether you're looking to set up a presence, whether you're looking to work with distribution partners or channels. Please excuse my Siri. I'm trying to join the conversation. But we really offer support through connections. So whether that be, your partners, your buyers, your distributors, your channel partners that can help make that move. It's a logistical support as well. So those third-party providers that really can support your growth. So whether it's, legal, finance and accounting, recruitment, marketing, market research, all those types of groups, we have dedicated lists to support you with your ambitions. It's about us sharing with you the opportunities we're aware of in market. So whether that's sort of general market insights, who you should be talking to, what are some of the broad opportunities that we see, into more in-depth, what are the procurement opportunities we're seeing, what is the private sector looking to buy, whether it's technology, services, hardware, software. But then it's also events and associations. So who should you be connecting with across your relevant industry? What events should you be going to? What should you be trying to speak at? But then also, how can you get involved with the work that the UK government is doing? So in market, we do networking events, we run roundtables, we host trade missions coming from the UK out into the Australian and New Zealand ecosystem. And we can also help you with your own events. So could you be hosting an event at our consulates, at our official residences, any of that support where we can help bring together as much of the Australian network to your door as possible. But then it's also promotional opportunities. So if you're doing fantastic work in the Australian New Zealand market, can we do case studies for you? Can we put you on our own social channels and really highlight you as much as possible into the Australian and New Zealand markets? We also have a relatively new service. 2 years isn't new, but for us, it's a fantastic service to have, called our export support service. And that's essentially a good starting point for those taking their first looks at the Australian market, or whether they might be tossing up between a number of different markets and then they just get a better sense of how they'll operate there. So it gives you access to a wide range of sector reports, market intelligence, guides relating to exporting, and there's a number of criteria. I won't read it off because you'll get the details later, but there's a criteria involved. And if you scan the QR code, you'll have a little bit more detail there. But essentially, between our sector teams and the export support service, we're here to support you as much as possible and obviously connect you into the fantastic resources that exist in the network, whether that be Austrade, whether it be the state governments, as David mentioned, and other third parties that all are really here to support you make the most of moving into the Australian market. And look, all in all, every day, innovative UK companies are coming out to Australia as a place to invest, to research, and to grow. And I do hope that for many of you on the call, Australia is going to be that next step, and you'll use the resources from myself, Austrade, and Sheltons, and of course the Chamber to really help you make that journey. I always like to say a couple of stats about why Australia, and David has covered off quite a few of them already, so good that we're singing from the same hymn sheet. But Australia is the 14th largest economy in the world. It offers a really sophisticated and tech-savvy market. There's open regulations, really strong governance, a really trusted financial system, growing talent, and world-class universities, and quite a similar business environment to the UK as well. Australia's trade and investment landscape is really dynamic. Several key areas are experiencing growth right now. So areas like renewable energy and critical minerals, agri-food, technology and innovation across areas like fintech, medtech, even quantum computing. Australia is quite vast, so it's always good to have that in your mind as you're going through. So it's still very accessible, but it's good to note that about 3/5, I think, currently of the population live in our 4 major cities. So that's Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth. And Australia's geographic position also allows really easy access from Australia into the rest of the Asia Pacific markets as well. So that's always a nice consideration when you're looking at Australia. Where else can you springboard if you set up a hub here? And obviously the opposite time zones, though sometimes difficult for calls like these, really also promote that opportunity for 24-hour dawn to dusk working. And again, echoing David's point, so I won't go into too much detail, but the free trade agreement has been fantastic. So please do make sure you look at the resources available on the elements that you can be adding into your market entry strategies, whether it is around those services provisions, the new and enhanced visa pathways, and that access to government procurement and reduction of some of those investment barriers that can really help you make that move. But please reach out, contact us, and we're here to help you as much as possible. And with that, I will hand back to Richard.
All right, we're now getting down to the nitty-gritties, which is the actual operating and procedural activities that are involved in setting up in a market like Australia. Well, I'm going to introduce you to Ned Shelton, the founder and managing partner of the Sheltons Accountant Australia and Sheltons Group. Ned will be covering, and his team, Courtney and Margaret, they'll be covering all sorts of things from where to base operations, considerations there, legal, tax, mobility provisions, setting up banks, brand protection, you name it. They will cover it. I think just based on the sheer number of items I just mentioned, they cannot get into the nitty-gritties. Too hard, too much detail, but clearly a heads up on the key areas you should be thinking about, and obviously making sure you're aware of the areas that you absolutely need to explore and get the right advice on before you make that big leap. So on that note, I will hand over to Ned Shelton, as I said, founder and managing partner. Thanks, Ned.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you so much to the Chamber for the opportunity of participating in this webinar. It was nice to hear a bit from Kirsty. We have done a lot of work over the years pre-COVID with running actual seminars with Department for Business and Trade, and well, back to when it was even called UK Trade and Investment, UKTI. So thank you for this opportunity. We're looking forward to it. We will be introducing, or Courtney and Margaret will be introducing themselves in a moment. I'm the founder of Sheltons Australia and am a director of Sheltons Accountants Australia, as well as Sheltons Legal. You'll be hearing from Courtney on what is Sheltons Legal in a moment. But before we get down to business, I have something very important. I know there are quite a number of people not based in the UK at the moment, but I'm speaking to those, wherever you may be located, who are Lions rugby supporters. You'll find that I'm a bit of a rugby fan, and I have this delicate problem in that the Lions are going to be fighting Australia in Australia as of the end of next month. And I please ask all Lions fans to leave the room. Happening. It's not much, it's an indication perhaps of the support, but fun fact, Australia was smashed by Wales at the World Cup in Lyon in September 2023 by Wales. It's true, I was there at the stadium. I cried with my own eyes, well, almost. But since then, the Australian rugby has really done well. Here in 2025, things are really looking up. And obviously the problem was back in 2023, that was in the Biden era. And now it's the Trump era and we're doing well. So somehow Mr. Trump must be, and Courtney, I think it's time for the next slide. It must be something to do with Trump making Australian rugby great again. So we're looking forward to the Lions tour, and may the better team win. Thank you very much. So moving on to more serious matters. Before we go further, I'm going to ask Courtney and Margaret to say a couple of words about themselves. Maybe if we can start with you, Margaret.
Thank you, Ned. Good evening. I'm in Australia, obviously. My name is Margaret Munetsi. I am the principal for Sheltons Australia, located in Sydney, Barangaroo. What does that mean? That means that I'm likely going to be your point of call when you first enter Australia and ongoing. I have regular touch points with you in your journey to ensure that you're meeting the requirements for the Australian government and basically just holding your hand as you come through into Australia. My background is I'm a chartered accountant, part of the Institute of Chartered Accountants for Australia and New Zealand. I am a registered tax agent and also a certified practitioner underneath the Institute as well. My area of expertise stems from a background in audit, internal and external. I've also done a lot of financial reporting, business advisory services, which is basically compliance and tax compliance matters, as well as tax planning and coordination within this environment. And we also touch on due diligence. We'll explain later on how Courtney's legal team and I work together to ensure that you are compliant. My experience has been with the Big Four. I was with Deloitte overseas as well as here in Australia, with mid-tier firm Nexia recently, and with a listed firm here in Australia as well. So I've had quite a broad exposure within the Australian market. So of my 26 years practicing, the majority of time has been between Australia and New Zealand, Australia being the more dominant. And I've also had experience in other jurisdictions as well. So I totally understand the ability of moving, the courage actually of moving and trying to explore another domain that you've never been in. Thank you. Back to you, Ned.
Thanks, Margaret. I guess, Courtney, it's your turn.
Thanks, Ned. Thanks, Margaret. Good morning, good evening. I'm Courtney Gleeson. I'm Principal Solicitor and Partner in charge of Sheltons Group Legal, which is Shelton's own Australian registered law practice. I'm an Australian qualified solicitor. I was admitted to practice in 2011 and practiced in Queensland, Australia for a number of years in general practice law in a boutique firm. Focusing on corporate and commercial, and I've lived in the UK since 2017 and been with Shelton since 2018. As mentioned, I am based in London and work here with fellow Australian qualified solicitors, and we'll go through a little bit more about Shelton's Group Legal throughout the course of the slides. So back to you, Ned.
Thank you very much, Courtney, and thanks, Margaret. You can see the outline here of the topics. This is as advertised. I will not read through these. You've had a chance to have a glance at them now. Nothing new compared to what you were sent originally or what you applied to, what you signed up for. So let's get the show on the road. So a little bit about Sheltons. We are a small firm. We have offices in Sydney, London, Singapore, and oddly enough, Copenhagen and Malta. We are very unusual, however, in that we only work with internationally operating businesses and with individuals to a degree, expats, executives. Not only do we operate only with internationally operating businesses, but we operate almost exclusively with inbound into Australia. That's changing gradually. We're working with more outbound from Australia, but there's mostly overseas-based businesses exporting to Australia or setting up operations in Australia. Also, we have about 55% of our business is from the UK. So we're very UK focused. Excuse me. We consider ourselves to be a one-stop shop in that we provide a broad range of services. We do not do auditing, but pretty much everything else. Thank you very much. We are very strong on tax. We work with double tax treaties quite extensively. I've written a book on the subject. We run courses on it, as you'll hear in a minute. So the tax is not all we do. It is an important part, but it is certainly not all we do. Again, it differentiates us from most small accounting firms. We work with UK companies who just simply employ Australian staff. Maybe they have one person working in Australia employed by the UK company, where we look after payroll, etc., going right through to fully fledged operating subsidiaries. And we often provide, in fact, I'd say 80% of the cases, we provide the local legally required resident Australian director and the public officer, which is a tax position under the tax law. There's a few other notes here. You can have a look at that in due course. You will be getting access to the slides after the show. Thank you. GST. It was the intention not to go through these in great detail. Thank you. So over to you, Courtney.
Thanks, Ned. As I mentioned earlier, Sheltons Group Legal is an Australian incorporated law firm and is 100% a sister company to Sheltons Accountants Australia. As with Sheltons Accountants, we work exclusively with internationally operating businesses, being exporters to Australia and inbound investors into Australia. Our Australian qualified solicitors, including myself, are based in London and work very closely, as Margaret mentioned, with Sheltons Accountants Australia to advise and assist clients with head offices within this time zone. Sheltons Group Legal provides advice and support in various areas such as intellectual property, drafting and review of commercial agreements, and commercial and corporate law. And we additionally provide assistance with due diligence projects for the acquisition or sale of entities, which might involve an Australian subsidiary. This also extends to advice on whether or not approval from the Foreign Investment Review Board, which is also known as FIRB, is necessary, which can actually be quite an arduous process and certainly has been known to hold a transaction up if a party is not aware that it is applicable. We're also able to provide assistance on Australian employment law, and this is in fact one of our most in-demand areas of advice and practice. Back to you, Ned.
One of the important things we do that distinguishes us from most accounting firms is that we run courses on international tax, normally around the world. Currently, we're only offering courses in London, but the participants typically come from various different countries. They are open courses where anyone can attend, or they are in-house courses designed for the specific client or customer. And that extends to providing courses for the HMRCs of different jurisdictions, the tax authorities of different jurisdictions, sometimes more than once. So I think we'd probably be the only small accounting firm in the world, actually, that has run several courses for the Mexican tax office in Mexico City and the South Korean tax office in Seoul and so on. It's a very important part of our business and has been since 1997. Right, the first non-Sheltons topic, where to base operations. Now, please understand that this is just a glimpse of a few random points. It is not a detailed analysis, a strategic analysis, but just a couple of interesting points that may have relevance to you. All of you will know Australia is big. That much you will know. Not everybody will know that we only have 27 million people, and probably not a lot of people are aware that nearly everyone is living within 50 kilometres of the coast. The green areas on this map are not the population centres. This is more about climate and geography. From east to west, so east is on your left. East is on your right and west is on your left. 4,000 kilometres. So from Perth to Sydney, for example, 4,000 kilometres. From north to south is about 3,000 kilometres as well. But everyone lives within that tiny, not everyone, almost everyone lives in that tiny fringe of 50 kilometres. Thank you. Thanks. So we have we're very proud of our Western Force Rugby Union team, the Super Pacific Rugby Super Pacific rugby team. Their closest home game, being based in Perth, Western Australia, their closest home game is 4 hours, 20 minutes flying time away. Or if they don't like flying and have to drive, it's 3,700. That's the closest home game. It's even closer to Jakarta. To Sydney from Perth and Brisbane is even longer at about 4,000 kilometres. Thanks, Courtney. Population is clumped into the cities, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth primarily, and Adelaide not to be forgotten. But that's about it. But you'll see Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, that's the east coast. with Brisbane northernmost, Melbourne southernmost, and Sydney being in the middle. So more than half of Australia is just in those three cities. That, of course, is greater. If you have to pick the population centre of Australia, it's probably going to be Sydney. You might be able to detect on the map here, on the right-hand side towards the top, Townsville. It's a fairly substantial town, by a city by Australian standards. Going down from Townsville, you'll see Brisbane. The text is in the orange on the actual Australian part, and down to Sydney, also down at the bottom on the orange part, and Melbourne, which is also on the orange part down towards the bottom. That's where the population is. That's where a good degree of business is, unless you're involved in things like natural resources. Iron ore, that's Western Australia. Coal, that's primarily Queensland, for example. If you're supplying to those industries, that's where you're going to be interested. But if you're supplying to most of the Australian people, where people are, then that's where you're going to be, especially from Brisbane down to Melbourne. Thank you. Costs. Of course, they're rising. Of course, everyone complains, like in every city in the world, practically. CBD, as we call it, the Central Business District. This is where we are in Sydney. Office space is approximately 1,100 per square metre per annum. Melbourne is reasonably significantly less, and Brisbane and Perth following. The outskirts, which is geographically the vast majority of these cities, is what counts. Because who needs to be in the CBD? You're not Barclays Bank thinking of setting up in Australia. If you are, you need to be in the Sydney CBD. At least your headquarters needs to be in the Sydney CBD. But for most of our clients, they don't need to be in the CBD. So it's all about the outskirts, the suburbs. The ranking in terms of costs is the same. The costs are very roughly half. It could be a third, it could be 80% of what it is in the CBD. That's office space. Salaries, Perth gets a mention. Things have become very expensive in Perth relatively, and increasing more rapidly perhaps than Sydney and Melbourne. The salaries, Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, top of the range. Brisbane and Adelaide, only about 10% less, so not a big difference. And this is gross generalizations here. Darwin and Hobart are the least expensive on average. Another aspect, what's happening where? What is going on in each of the cities? Sydney, it's not a coincidence I mentioned Barclays in connection with Sydney, finance, technology, tourism, etc. Okay. Perth, as I mentioned, resources, natural resources, mining, oil and gas, etc. Defence can be Adelaide, can be Canberra, but of course, these are generalizations. There's manufacturing everywhere, of course. There's tourism everywhere, but these are just the key sectors associated with each of these main locations. Time zones, ever important when we're speaking to people from most of the world. There's not just a UK thing, it's not just a Western Europe thing. North America, most of the world is in the wrong hemisphere when it comes to Australia, and this is a problem. Note that New South Wales and Victoria have what we call daylight saving, so we go over to summertime, but never in Queensland, never in Western Australia. They stay. We like to think because the Queenslanders can't figure it out, they get too complicated. So we keep it simple for them. No, it's not for that reason. Sorry, Courtney's smirking, she's a Queenslander. I'm from New South Wales originally. Perth is 2 or 3 hours closer to the UK. So 7 or 8 hours closer. And if you look at the snips below, you'll see that that is actually significant. And we've mentioned in the bullet point there that Sydney and Melbourne are either 8, 9, 10 hours, half the year 8 hours, half the year 10 hours ahead of the UK. The 9 hours is just for a week or 2 or 3 in the middle there when summertime changes, comes and goes. But basically, Perth is the only place you're going to have where you have a sensible crossover in terms of office hours between the UK and Australia. Look at markets. Now we're covering what people do master's thesis on in 30 seconds here. Obviously, it's important there are differences whether we're talking physical goods or services. We heard how Australian product production, 70% is services. I'd say most of our clients of the Sydney office from the UK are providing services, but a good number provide physical goods. Some are selling to supermarkets, some are doing infrastructure, some are doing subcontracting, delivering bits and bobs to secret submarines. There's a whole range of things, but more typically services. The question is whether you have just one customer, one or two customers, or whether you're ongoing selling. Do you need a sales operation in Australia? If you've got one customer being a supermarket and your whole work in Australia is delivering to that supermarket, that dictates a whole range of things. If you're looking at the retail market and you're ongoing selling something to people, then you need to be in a different location. There's a couple of examples here which I don't think it's really important to go through them here. You can have a look in due course. Address is very important. People do get confused about the different addresses. First point here is the official registered office of the branch or company. It can be literally anywhere in Australia. This is the one that's registered with ASIC, which is our equivalent of Companies House in the UK. It doesn't matter where that is. It can be in Perth and you can be doing business in a completely different part of Australia. There's also the principal place of business. It might not exist. This is where the activities are carried on. There's a similar concept in the UK. This is where HMRC likes to know where it exists for VAT purposes especially. But often our clients don't even have an employee in Australia. They've got a subsidiary, but they don't have an employee. Or they do have a couple of employees, but they work from home. So there's no principal place of business. That's no problem. We get around that in a certain way. For the tax office, the ATO, the equivalent of HMRC, there is an address for their correspondence. That's very frequently our address. There's an address for ASIC, the equivalent of Companies House, and that is, again, typically our address, but that can be all different addresses. So moving right along, we're going to have a look at a few differences between Australia and the UK. It's not the only part of this presentation where we are talking about differences. It'll come up in other slides as well. The UK still has significant legislation, tax, law, etc., that it developed during the period it was a member of the EU. Australia has never had anything other than independent legislation. We have invented everything ourselves. And we do discriminate. We discriminate, obviously, in relation to visas, where people come from, their nationalities. We discriminate in terms even of the need to be audited. You have a subsidiary in Australia, or a subsidiary in Australia owned by Australian residents does not need to be audited if it's small, or prepare financial statements for delivery to access if it's small. But if that same subsidiary is owned by a non-resident company, then suddenly it has to. So the obligations when it's non-Australian owned are greater than if it's Australian owned. However, given that if it's still a small company, it's owned by a UK company, there is an application, there is a process to have that exempted from the requirement. But that's an action that has to be taken. And we do this on a daily basis, for example. Whereas a local accounting practice dealing with the local businesses would never have come across this this process of needing an exemption, let alone making the application for the exemption. We have a lot of, as we say, heaps, not loads, but we have heaps of free trade agreements because we've been at it for some 30 years. I think our first free trade agreement was with our first cousins over the water in New Zealand. We have a significant number of free trade agreements. Another completely random difference is that we don't have anything like the UK LLP, the Limited Liability Partnership. Under the Limited Liability Partnership Act of 2000, we don't have any animal like that at all. Fringe benefits tax, UK does not have this, not the way it is in Australia. This is where the employer has to pay tax on benefits paid to the employee. For example, private medical insurance, accommodation, etc. And this works through a tax return that the Australian employer has to file for a different accounting year for 31 March, where the employer pays the tax relevant to the benefits given to the employee. It is not on the employee, it's on the employer. Big difference. Over to you, Margaret.
Thanks, Ned. Just to add on around the time zones, it can get quite difficult because we are quite far away from you, but there is a lot of benefit in having Ned and Courtney in Europe and their teams there. It allows us to seamlessly work. They pick up things that we don't see overnight, and then we pick them up when we wake up in the morning, which works really well. Just to expand on those differences that Ned was just explaining, I thought I would touch on some of the tax differences. In the UK, the tax is gradual for corporates. My focus is on corporates, ranging from about 19 to 25% based on the profitability of the business. That's not how it works in Australia. In Australia, you either pay 25% or 30%. And this is after we've done some tests to establish the turnover of the group, not just the company, but the group, and also looking at the type of activity, if it's a trading activity or passive, that all comes into it. So there are rules around that. I just thought I'd sort of highly touch on that. We look at that in detail for you and do the tests that we need to. Value-added tax is referred to as GST, Goods and Services Tax here in Australia. The percentage is 10%, half of what it is in the UK. Other differences between UK and Australia is the requirements of the office holders. In Australia, a resident director, which is a service that we offer as well, can assist with facilitating the speed of setting up bank accounts, setting up a company altogether, and then later on adding the foreign directors. And we are seeing that in the UK, this is becoming more relevant, but in Australia, we are quite ahead in that because of anti-money laundering. And I'll touch on this later on in the presentation on how we assist in actually setting up bank accounts. Another confusing thing is the year ends. Australian year end is 30 June, UK is 31st. We do find that some of the UK entities then, based on other activities around the world, might even go for a December year end. So we do, and help clients constantly with this. We apply for what's called a substituted accounting period, pretty much as soon as you enter, which then aligns the Australian entity to whichever entity you would like, if it's UK or otherwise. To add some confusion, and I had to explain this to a client the other day, is that despite the fact that you might be granted a substituted accounting period, certain things such as superannuation and GST reporting is still aligned to an Australian system. So Q1 for Australia is September, whereas the the UK would be 3 months after the March year end. So they're just those nuances that we would then help you ensure that you meet those requirements. So in the UK, there's the unique taxpayer reference. We refer to that as your tax file number. It is totally different to an ABN, which I'll explain in a little while. So that is the number that the ATO uses to identify you and is quoted on quite a few documents with the ATO. And we try not to transmit that via email, etc. There's some regulations around that, but just thought I'd give you that distinction in the way we refer to it here in Australia. Ned touched on the tax treaties and his experience in this area. You might have heard these referred to as double tax agreements. So we've got about 40, whereas the UK has about 130. So it is a lot larger in the UK, but we do have specific common ones that come up in Australia. A public officer, as Ned pointed out, is something that's attached to the ATO, the Australian Taxation Office. It doesn't exist in the UK, but it's quite an onerous task because when you're signing off on anything that's submitted to the Australian Tax Office, you need to be sure that you're happy with what is actually included in that return. And we do assist in this area as well, but we also assist in guiding whoever you appoint as the public officer, ensuring that they are comfortable with what is lodged. In the UK, Companies House requires companies to lodge financials which are readily available to the public. As Ned noted earlier, there is an exemption here in Australia, and my team and I were actually touching on this yesterday, and there's no fine for not having lodged or applied for this particular exemption, but it can open a can of worms if it's not done properly, whereby auditing or reviewing of the global entity are pulled in. So we're very, very specific and work very closely with Shelton's Legal to ensure that that is done with ASIC to ensure that we're not opening that can of worms. The dividend system, for those that are old enough to remember the imputation system that you had in the UK, is still very much active here in Australia. And what it is basically is we create an account for any tax paid. And when we get to a point of distributing any dividends or retained earnings, the profits that accumulated over years, we are allowed to attach those credits, basically reducing tax payable within Australia. With companies that are ultimately held 100% by a UK entity, we work with management to ensure that we utilize that and avoid any double tax or tax within Australia altogether. I referred to the Australian business number. So this is a 11-digit number that's issued. So we set up a company using ASIC, which is equivalent to Companies House. We then, when activity starts within an entity, normally when you hit the 75,000 mark, but you can do it voluntarily, you then, in turnover, we apply for this ABN. And this ABN basically alerts other companies of the fact that you are active. Failure to have this number means that the person that you're in business with will have to withhold about 47%, which is massive. So we normally, as we set up the entity, apply for the ABN. We will talk about documents that have to be certified, and we use them in multiple places within this process that I've just described, and Courtney and her team facilitate that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Just very briefly on individuals, although individuals are very important. All directors of an Australian company, all directors need a DIN, Director Identification Number. If the proposed director does not have an Australian tax file number, which most of our foreign-based directors don't have, then it will take a couple of months and you cannot be appointed director until you get that. Who needs to file a tax return? Simple wage earners in the UK do not need to file UK tax returns or self-assessment returns, for some reason it's referred to, because there's self-assessment everywhere. But in Australia, everybody basically needs to file a tax return. That's next one, Courtney, thank you. Very importantly, we have a PAYG system which includes the tax withheld on salaries like PAYE in the UK. However, the PAYG system covers significant other amounts of taxes. It covers, for example, advanced company tax. It covers interest withholding tax to be paid, royalty withholding tax. That all goes in the same return, the same title, PAYG. So they're all lumped together when you do the returns. So it's a lot more than the tax on the salaries. All right, Courtney, over to you again.
Thanks, Ned. We're just going to speak briefly now about an overview of forming a company in Australia, as well as some examples of ongoing requirements, which Ned and Margaret have touched on briefly already. Setting up a company in Australia is very similar to how you go about it in the UK, in that the entity can be set up in essentially the same day. That's actually the easiest part. However, the ABN and bank accounts can take months, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly. The company will be listed with the Australian Corporate Regulator, which is known as ASIC, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. Again, that's the equivalent of Companies House in Australia. Similar to the UK, when setting up the company, there's no minimum required share capital. There are additional various requirements under the Corporations Act, which is the Australian corporate regulations, in relation to the corporate registers, which must be set up and maintained by the company and kept up to date following incorporation. Again, very similar to in the UK. As Margaret mentioned earlier, one of the biggest differences between a company in Australia and the UK is the requirement under company law for each company to have an Australian resident director. All directors also have to have this DIN, Director Identification Number, before they're able to be appointed as directors. As mentioned, for resident directors who hold a tax file number, this is no issue. It's pretty much immediate that you can apply and be provided with this number. However, for non-resident directors, it can take up to 2 months to obtain a DIN, but you do only ever need one. So one individual can have one DIN for their lifetime, and it will apply to every company that they might act as director for in the future. In addition to this, any company that is trading is required to have a public officer, which we won't go into in too much detail because Margaret has, of course, already touched on this, but it is a Tax Act requirement, and that individual is responsible for signing the company tax return. Just to provide a little bit more information about the Australian business number, ABN process, it's a very important factor to be aware of, in that in order to trade in Australia, you have to have this. So for the majority of our UK and overseas clients, due to the international element of having overseas directors and shareholders, the process of obtaining an ABN can actually take months. The reason for this is that in order to obtain an ABN, you do need to submit documents, which can only be certified by the Australian High Commission or a notary public. So these documents include proof of identity for directors and shareholders, and they are usually required to be physically couriered to Australia from the UK or from the physical location in which the individual is, which obviously takes additional time. As we know, it's often not a quick process to get documents and packages from Australia to the UK and vice versa. From there, the application is submitted to the Australian Tax Office, and it then will take an additional around 28 days for the application and supporting documents to be reviewed and, fingers crossed, approved. Given Shelton's accountants' relationship with the non-resident team at the Australian Tax Office, they have been known to speed up the process though, which is obviously always very much the aim. Another thing to note is that small companies are generally not required to file financial statements, as both Ned and Margaret mentioned. However, this isn't the case if they're owned by a foreign entity. There is a possibility for applying for an exemption in the event that it is considered a small company. And as previously mentioned, it can often be the case that perhaps more domestic advisors aren't aware of this. And if it's sort of found out that the company should have been providing these financial statements as they're foreign owned and haven't requested the exemption, then it can obviously cause a complete amount of frustration and additional cost and compliance requirements. We'll now move on to some points relating to setting up a branch versus incorporating an Australian entity, which Ned will take us through briefly now. Thanks, Ned. You're
After
still
I make
muted.
two more comments, Courtney quite correctly stated that the public officer signs a tax return. That's true, but it wasn't relevant in Courtney's part of the presentation. But another little detail is that the public officer is personally responsible for the taxes of the company. So if the company doesn't pay, they will go after the public officer. There is a reason the Australian legislation requires a public officer and requires the public officer to be in Australia so they can get at them. So the directors are still also liable, including especially the Australian resident director, but the public officer is specifically liable for the taxes under the Tax Act, under Section 252 of the Income Tax Act. Their house and home is at stake. The other quick comment was ABN. And as Courtney, of course, was describing from the UK point of view, with your subsidiary or branch in Australia, what you need to do to get an ABN. It takes a couple of months. But if it is an Australian-owned Australian company, the ABN is available instantaneously online. And again, a lot of people not used to dealing with foreign-owned Australian companies or foreign-owned operations in Australia don't realise this. And we often get clients get in touch with clients for the first time because they say, oh, our existing accountants have been trying to get an ABN for 6 months and we still haven't got it. We can't employ people. We can't commence business. Can you help out? For us, it's daily routine because, as we said, practically all of our clients are foreign-based businesses coming into Australia. It is a special regime. This couple of minutes now on branch versus subsidiary is more about the differences and what you might prefer to the extent you have a choice or what you would like to avoid. A branch is just a colloquial term for the presence in Australia of the foreign, for example, UK company that requires registration with ASIC. Essentially, it says, the legislation says, if you're carrying on business in Australia, you first need to register. What does carry on business mean? Of course, that's vague. Then you can apply for an ABN. The process of registering a branch with ASIC is time consuming. It's not the one day that it takes for the company. That process alone can take a month or two for certain reasons. Then you can put in your application for the ABN. So it's a longer process as well. Every branch needs an Australian agent. So it's roughly equivalent to a director in the corporate world, an agent for the branch. We provide that service. And we also do provide the public officer service as well. Thank you. In terms of accounts, as we've stated, Australian-owned small companies don't need to file anything with ASIC and don't need to be audited, but foreign-owned small companies do. If the owner is a company, which most of our clients, it's a company abroad that owns it, then you do unless you get the application. This is just a repetition of what we've mentioned before earlier. For a branch, where it's literally a branch under the Corporations Act, what has to be filed with ASIC is the accounts of the UK company plus a cash flow statement. That's annual. It has to be done annually. And there's a fee of about $1,000, a filing fee for that. We've talked about the tax year and the ability to get a substituted accounting period. key element in deciding whether you can get by with a branch rather than a subsidiary, rather than a company, is whether your presence in Australia constitutes a so-called permanent establishment. A permanent establishment is a presence that gives rise to the need to pay tax on the profits of the branch, on the profits of the PE. And there are different kinds of permanent establishment, which we'll see in a little while. The tax rates are the same on a branch and a company, either the 25% or the 30% based on what we've just heard. But it's more complicated in determining the profits. What is the base? What is the taxable profits, the so-called attributable profits to a branch? More complex, more risk for arguments between the ATO and HMRC. Whereas the subsidiary is a simpler case to calculate the taxes. It's not always simple, but relative to the PE situation is simpler. Thank you. Different types of PE. There's the main rule PE, which again, a bit like the Corporations Act, says if you're carrying on business through a fixed place of business, then you have a PE. At least if it lasts about 6 months or more, that's the general practice. Or if you have a project in Australia that lasts 12 months, that would be construction or assembly project or an installation project lasting for 12 months. That's a PE. If you have substantial equipment in Australia, you have a PE. And I'm skipping forward because under the double tax treaty with the UK, that is not a PE. This is Australian. Oh, yes, it is. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Contract manufacturing, we won't spend time on. Dependent agent PE is a tricky one. This is where you're operating in Australia through an agent. You don't have an actual presence in Australia. But if your agent is dependent on you, in other words, if the agent is working mainly for you, roughly 80% of their income is from business, from acting for you, then you have a permanent establishment in Australia. That's called a dependent agent. So rather tricky. Residency, very important. If your Australian company is managed and controlled in the UK, it's going to be a resident of the UK under internal UK rules. It will still remain a resident of Australia because it's incorporated there. So it's a dual resident. The tax treaty changed about 4 years ago in relation to this so-called dual resident situation. And now you have to go to the Australian Tax Office at HMRC and get them to come to an agreement on where that entity is actually a resident. In the meantime, it is not able to take advantage of any aspect of the double tax treaty. Very important key takeaway here is if your Australian subsidiary is in reality managed and controlled in the UK, you need to have a look at it if you haven't already done that. Sorry, Courtney, just wanted to mention here, the dividend from an Australian subsidiary paid to a UK parent is probably going to be exempt from tax when received in the UK under UK internal domestic rules, not because of the treaty. And if the profits have been taxed in the subsidiary at 25 or 30%, then there'll be no withholding tax. If the dividend is paid from profits that have not been taxed, then there will be a dividend withholding tax, even after the reduction according to the tax treaty. So it becomes very important to know what dividends you're paying from taxed profits or untaxed profits. Thank you. So just to wrap up, if you're a UK corporate, looking at the tax point of view, you'd prefer to operate in Australia, perhaps, from the tax point of view, without having a permanent establishment. If you can avoid falling into that trap, makes life simpler. If you are comparing a permanent establishment versus a subsidiary, basically the tax is the same. On the non-tax aspects, it's easier to do business in Australia through a subsidiary than for the UK company to be doing the business. For example, if you have an employee, that employee is going to be faced with the issue of, am I comfortable being employed by a UK entity? Am I going to lose some kind of rights, etc., etc.? It's uncomfortable. But otherwise, the costs are pretty much the same. If you're going to have a PE, it's going to cost you about the same to run having the branch stroke PE than running a subsidiary. And of course, if you don't have a subsidiary, the assets of the UK company itself are at risk if everything goes pear-shaped. If you have a subsidiary, it's only the subsidiary that loses the assets. Okay. Margaret.
Thanks, Ned. I'll keep this brief. So with the banks, I think I touched on this earlier, there has been increased scrutiny by the banks when we are opening an account for, especially where we have a complex structure in place. The banks need us to ensure that we've done our due diligence before we approach them. And Courtney and I work closely together on this, making sure those notarized documents come across. And once they do, there are forms that need to be filled in, etc. And it can take 2 to 4 months, but even extended to 6. It is quite an onerous task. But once you have the bank account set up, it operates quite easily. What we do find is that we do have relationships with banks because we do this very often. We know who to approach with what documentation to facilitate this process. One thing not included in this as well, the final step is then also setting up the internet banking, which makes the process for you to manage your own account going forward even more simple. We do also offer a facility where we can manage the process for you here in Australia. Thank you.
Ned, sorry, you're on
Thanks,
mute.
Margaret. I'm just going to make a couple of quick points on the next slides. If you could go to the next one, Courtney. There are 2 cases we would normally be talking about, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to abbreviate this. One key point is a lot of people think if you send a UK employee out, the UK remains a resident of the UK, but they're working in Australia, that they don't have a problem in terms of tax on their salary unless they've been in Australia for more than 183 days. That is misleading. That might be true, but it's not true if the employee is working for an Australian employer. So let's say you've got a subsidiary, you send someone out there for a few months to work, they don't exceed 183 days. Are they working for the Australian company? Because if they are, then they're taxed from day one. But the tricky part here is they can be deemed to be working for the Australian company. If they're working for the benefit of the Australian company and the Australian company then reimburses the UK for the salary, they're still paid in the UK normally and probably, unluckily, having PAYE withheld. If they're working for the Australian company, deemed to be working for the Australian company, they're taxed from day one. They only will get the 183-day benefit if they're not working for the Australian company. So a normal UK business person going out and looking around and talking to potential client, customers, whatever, making sure that the subsidiary is complying with UK instructions in terms of policies and procedures, etc., that's okay because they're not working for the benefit of the Australian subsidiary. They can be there for up to 183 days without any worries. Thank you. We go on to the next one. This is where the employee becomes a resident of Australia. If they're on a temporary visa, then they will not be taxed on anything other than salary. So foreign rental income will not be taxed. But if they later get permanent residency or citizenship, they're taxed on their worldwide income, including the home they're renting out in the UK, including the dividends and capital gains from the sale of shares in UK companies, etc. Thank you. Many of our clients have individuals who are resident of both countries for a certain period of time. That causes some issues, needs to be addressed. It is not uncommon to be a dual resident. I guess that's you, Courtney.
That is. Thank you, Ned. We'll now move on quickly. We're running a little bit short of time to some other considerations for if employees are relocated to Australia or Australian-based employees are hired, focusing on an overview of Australian employment law, a very high-level overview. Employment law in Australia is relatively similar to that of the UK. However, there are key differences which employers should be aware of when dealing with Australian-based employees. Employment relationships in Australia are governed by a variety of state and federal laws, the principal act being the Fair Work Act, shortened to FWA, which is applied countrywide and has undergone some recent amendments and updates. There's also multiple state and territory frameworks that cover issues such as health and safety, workers' compensation obligations, equal opportunity considerations, and long service leave entitlements, just to name a few. Much like in the UK, employees are consistently favoured by Australian workplace laws, which means that it's critical for employers to be well informed of their obligations to effectively manage a workplace in Australia. The National Employment Standards, shortened to the NES, is a key part of the Fair Work Act that all businesses who deal with employees in Australia should be well versed in. The NES was introduced in 2010 and does provide minimum entitlements for all employees in Australia. You can see listed here the matters which are covered by the National Employment Standards. We won't go through these in full. However, it's incredibly important, and as you'll note, that all employees, once again, in Australia are covered by this. It can't be displaced by the terms of a contract of employment or any other enterprise agreement. So it means that employers are basically not able to contract out of their obligations to provide any of the minimum standards which are set by the National Employment Standards. Employers and employees are generally free to negotiate terms of their employment contract, however, so there's nothing preventing an employment contract from specifying a much more generous entitlement than the minimum standards provided under the National Employment, if that is so agreed. In addition to the Fair Work Act and National Employment Standards, there's also modern awards, and they're in place in relation to a large number of industries. Basically, these are instruments that apply at the level of industry or occupation and include minimum terms and conditions for employees covered by those instruments. And these entitlements are on top of the National Employment Standards. Awards cover a large proportion of the workforce in Australia and they can't be opted out of by employers. There's actually currently over 120 modern awards which apply to employees in Australia. Again, terms negotiated in contracts must result in employees being better off overall than they would be if they received the base entitlements under the modern awards. In terms of the coverage and from a compliance perspective, the awards include minimum rates of pay, including overtime, penalty rates, leave loading, and other allowances. And you'll see on this slide which factors must apply to an employee in order for them to be covered by an award. And it's also important to note that employers often wrongly assume that the national minimum wage solely determines the minimum amount that employees must be paid. However, this isn't the case. If an award applies, then the wage will be set out in that award. There also can be confusion in that, dependent on the type of business you have and the type of industry you operate in, you might actually have employees within your own business who are covered by different awards if it wasn't already complex enough. Failing to comply with these, though, can lead to miscalculations in pay, overtime, and other entitlements, and significant liability, potentially including back pay, as well as a risk of potential penalties and reputational damage. We've just set out here a few considerations for UK entities sending workers out to Australia or otherwise employing individuals directly in Australia. Basically, Australian law will apply. So as hopefully has been pretty clear from the previous slides in my brief overview, the Fair Work Act, National Employment Standards, and any award will always supersede the terms of any employment agreement in circumstances where that agreement is less favourable to the employee than the base standard set by the relevant legislation. So in that respect, it's imperative that businesses have an understanding of Australian employment law. And there are various examples, even though the legislation is relatively similar to that of the UK, there are different types of leave. For example, leave entitlements. Annual leave is accrued. It continues to accrue throughout the course of employment, and various other small, seemingly small factors which can actually result in concerns for companies. We've just briefly set out here some considerations of brand protection. As you would know, trademarks are obviously very important. It's a sign, word, phrase, even a smell or sound used to distinguish your goods and services. And they're very important to identify businesses and do contribute, obviously, to the value of a business. Most importantly here, we've had in the past clients who've indicated a belief that since they've registered a trademark in the UK, they're also somehow protected from use of that mark by a third party in the Australian jurisdiction. That's definitely not the case, unfortunately. So the best way to avoid this is to register with IP Australia. This can be a relatively straightforward process. That's obviously very dependent on the type of application being made and whether or not there are any existing trademarks held by other businesses. Obtaining an Australian .com.au domain name is also an important factor to consider, and we've just set out here some requirements for applicants in order to be able to obtain that .com.au domain. And just finally, on the point of brand protection, it is also possible in Australia to register a business name that you're able to trade under. These can be applied for 1 or 3 years, and you then must continue reapplying. Holding this can assist in any trademark application, and there are limitations on the names that you can use depending on whether or not it's already in use. But it's certainly something that we always advise our clients to look into and obtain if possible. And now we've got some real world case studies that we've set out here, though I am conscious that we are running short in time. So Ned, I'll hand to you if you wanted to mention anything in relation to this first one.
Yes, I think our time is up. So everyone will be able to read these. It's fairly self-explanatory, we think. So my suggestion is you have a look at these. If you have any questions at all about these case studies or anything else for that matter, you'll find our contact details on the slides, both number 1 and the last slide as well. So let us know. But I think in the interest of time, we'll just move on and hand back to Richard.
Thank you very much, Ned, Courtney, and Margaret. Look, no surprise to say there is a lot of areas and activities to cover in setting up and moving into Australia. There are no shortcuts. I think that's probably the very simple comment to make right up front. But there's clearly resources and expertise out there. And if there's one message that we really need to send out is use the professional advice. We've had various people tell us that they tried to do it themselves, came unstuck, and it was a false economy. And so our strong recommendation from everyone we speak to is go to the professionals like Sheltons. They are well versed in all the various checklists of the things you need to cover, and they can move through it with a great deal of efficiency and proficiency. So that is our strong recommendation. Thank you to the other speakers, Kirsty, as well as David Camalengo. Again, there's government resources there that people, individuals and companies can tap into, and we support that process. Final note, we will send a follow-up note and thank you email with copy of the webinar itself, a link to the webinar, and also contact details for Ned, Margaret and Courtney. For any questions you may have, and I'm certain you will have them. There's plenty to have to digest, and things will sort of, I know, become sort of more obvious about what you needed more information around as you go through the deck. So on that note, we're going to finish ahead of time. I thought I'd make that comment when we talk about proficiency and efficiency. So look, thank you again to all the people that have joined us. And we look forward to speaking to you and seeing you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.